I'd like to welcome council members, council staff and any members of the public who are online to this information session. Councillor Nathan Shanks is... Deputy Mayor. Nathan Shanks is an apology and Councillor Vallelonga is an apology. Thank you. I will now hand over this session over to Sharon Perkins to introduce the topic under discussion this evening.
Thank you everyone for coming along. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land that we gather on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with the country, and we also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region and recognise that their cultural and heritage belief remains significant to the living Kaurna people today. Thanks for coming along. So this is one of our first budget sessions, information sessions for the development of the 25-26 budget. As set out in the budget timetable, the focus of tonight's session is actually on the recurrent budget. And the recurrent budget probably represents about 90 to 95% of our total budget. So it is a significant component, so it is actually important that we spend some time focusing on the recurrent budget and we get the recurrent budget right. And as I've said through previous sessions, especially during the long-term financial plan development, for us to actually return back to financial sustainability, it is the focus of the recurrent budget that we need to get right, because that actually underpins basically the cost structure of the council. So just as a bit of a reminder, I know that it hasn't been that long since we actually adopted the long-term financial plan, but the development of this budget is actually underpinned by the financial strategy that we actually set out in the long-term financial plan. So that the overall arching goal is actually to become sustainable, to be an ongoing sustainable council. That means that we can actually provide our services without any price shocks to the community. We can maintain our services, we can maintain our infrastructure, and ultimately our ultimate goal is to actually bring our borrowings level back into what would be considered an appropriate level, and reduce that dependency that we actually have on our overdraft facility. So this is actually the first year of pretty much the long-term financial plan. So if we stray off the financial strategy from day one, I suppose we will be challenged to actually try and achieve our long-term goal. So underpinning those goals is that we actually have five strategies. So it is about maintaining our tight control over our expenditure, and fundamentally in these next couple of years it is actually about reducing our cost base of the organisation, narrowing infrastructure gap, making sure that we're investing correctly, we're investing the right way, we're using the right funding sources, so we're trying to actually get grant funds, and also make sure that we're actually ticking the benchmarks that we've actually got. So that strategy underpins the long-term financial plan, but the key aspect for the budget, especially the recurrent budget, is that first financial strategy, is actually maintaining tight control over expenditure. So what we actually did when we actually went out to staff, we as an executive team, we actually got the leadership group in together, and we actually went through and sort of had a discussion with them to sit there and say, okay, well this is the lay of the land, and these are the things that we actually want you to do when you actually go back and start developing your budgets and making your budget submissions from a recurrent perspective. So the main messaging that we actually provided to staff was it is actually zero-based budgeting. So it is not a position when you're making your budget submissions, it is not what I spent last year plus a percentage to actually increase it, is actually going back to that, going back to zero and starting again, and actually looking at what you're actually doing and what you actually need to do and the cost to actually deliver those. Because, as I said, we do have a need to actually reduce our underlying cost base. One of the other things as well is that, you know, everyone sort of sits there and says, oh, that means you're going to cut cost. And it's not about cutting cost. It's actually about considering efficiency improvements before we add the cost. So if we actually got something new, how can we do it with our existing resources before we actually automatically sit there and say, oh, okay, we've got a new park to maintain now because a developer has given one. It's like, okay, well, how can I incorporate the service needs of this reserve into what I do day to day? You know, how can I do it with what I've got today? And also understanding what's actually being delivered within the current budget. You know, I think the issue with the recurrent budget is that it relates to things that we do all the time, every time. So it just becomes a natural thing of, you know, oh yeah, well, we had it last time and we'll do it again. So it was going back to sit there and say, actually understand what you're actually delivering with your money, and understand what you asked for, and are you actually delivering that? And do you think you've got any? If you haven't been delivering it, a particular service or something that you wanted to do, ask the question about, well, I haven't been delivering it. Am I really going to, what has changed to actually be in a position for me to actually deliver it this year? And if nothing has changed, really consider whether you actually need that funding allocation. Yes, Paul, you can.
Just quickly, how is that different to doing a service review?
I suppose they're mini service reviews. I would sit there and say a service review is probably a higher, more detailed analysis, and it's actually probably looking at things about what we're delivering versus like more high-level services. Where I'm talking about these things as to sit there and say, and I'll use you, David, as an example. The community services team had budgeted to deliver a program, and they'd been budgeting to deliver a program for a couple of years, and then literally, and David sort of said, well, have we delivered it? Have we ever delivered it? Are we going to deliver it again? And so the question is to sit there and say, oh no, we don't have the resources. Well, has nothing changed? So that was a service, like I suppose that was a surface level review, and a decision was made of, we haven't delivered the service. We've said that we're going to deliver the service. We probably still don't have the capacity to deliver the service, so we're actually not going to kid ourselves and think that we're going to deliver the service this year. Whereas a service review is actually a more in-depth as to sit there and say it's based on, is the service valued by the community? Is it something that's wanted? Is it something that is needed? So it's more in-depth. It's more structured and more, from that perspective. And because I think the service reviews is about making sure that we're delivering on a wider scale and a bigger scale the services, and we're providing value-added services. So, Chris, did you want to say something?
And just to complement what you said there, for me, the budgeting process is the team looking at how they can deliver the service more efficiently. So it's kind of, we should do that every day. The service review, for me, is one, as Sharon said, do you or don't you offer that service? That's the fundamental. If you say you're going to, it actually triggers, for me, the opportunity to rethink how you deliver, totally rethink how you deliver it, and will you deliver it in a different fashion but still deliver a service. Whereas the budgeting process really is just about how we can refine what we're currently doing. For me, that's the differentiation.
Is that where you're going to find 3.5% real savings?
So Sharon will get to it in a minute, but we have actually incorporated the savings into this budget that's before you.
Right.
So what we have to demonstrate here is we've finished this year with a deficit of 1.5 million. In a few slides' time, sorry to steal your thunder, Sharon.
That's right.
We'll show that we're currently projecting a very minor surplus. So the only way we'll be able to do that is actually cut costs from the business. Yeah.
efficiency gains.
Yep. Absolutely. So Shannon's got some slides she'll walk us through.
And the other thing that we really heard, sent home to staff, and I think that this also needs to come back to the chamber as well, is we have increased our funding capability, our facility, because we actually need to. We needed to increase that facility to actually do the things that we need to do to actually position ourselves in a better position. But that facility came with conditions, and one of the conditions is that as a council, as an organisation, by the June 2028, this is LGFA's condition, we have to actually have achieved a positive operating surplus ratio. So we have to actually be back in the black, you know. So this is actually driving. So we'd be like, you know, obviously, I've been sort of sitting there, and the audit committee has been saying that messaging in the chamber, and that messaging has actually been down to the leadership team, who's then passed it down to their respective teams as well. And I have to sit there and say that the response from the organisation and the team has been fantastic. You know, it's to sit there and say, I think that there was a few rolling eyes in heads and thinking, oh my God, this is ridiculous, how the hell we're going to do it. But collectively, as an organisation, we have come together and have really critically reviewed what we do, how we do it, and what do we think that we can actually do it. And I think it's one of the, and it is just a different change of mindset that we will actually have to go through. And to answer your question, Paul, I think this first year's budget, I think that it is a question on, yes, we have delivered the we have reduced our cost base by 3.5%, but I think it is that first things of what you actually do initially when you actually go on this, you know, it's no different when you're at home and you decide that you have to save some money. You just make these little twinks around the edge and all that sort of stuff. So you pick up the low-hanging fruit, and I'll sit there and say this budget has actually done that, has actually had a disciplined approach of making sure that we're picking up all that low-hanging fruit. There are things in there that we have sat there and said, okay, well, we are doing this a different way, and we expect it to deliver permanent savings. So next year, that is where it is the fundamental things, or probably as we progress through this financial year, as we go, it is those big fundamental questions about what's the structural change that is required for the business to actually be able to continue to find those real and ongoing savings. So that's where I think the service reviews will play the part in the next 12 months to actually position ourselves to actually put a budget in for the 26-27 financial year, because you can't go from where we were and then expect a structural change in 12 months. It's just not, you know, it will be numbers written on a page without actually any substance behind it. And realistically, we need some substance behind that. And again, it's that cultural change and bringing the leadership group and the organisation along with it, because, you know, as an executive team, we're only 5 people in the room. We can't do it ourselves. You know, we need the organisation, so we need to do that in that way. So I think that structural change will be the challenge for us to actually be able to make. And again, and it's probably going to be a challenge for the chamber as well, because there potentially is going to have to be some hard decisions, because as part of that review, there might be a particular service that you might want, but it might come out that it's not valued by the community, or and all that sort of stuff, and you're going to have to make some of those hard decisions. But again, there's probably going to be a small portion of the community that still want it, but the wider part of the community don't value it. So would sit there and say that there's probably some hard decisions that need to be made, but I would sit there and say that the savings that have been delivered this year have been that low-hanging fruit, predominantly around it, and thinking and changing the way that we actually think about how we develop the budget, and working out how we need the cost to run that. Yep.
Just quickly, will you be giving us a list? Will you be giving us a list of those savings so we've got an idea of where it's happening and how it's happening?
It's I've tried to do it, but I suspect what I'm going to give you is not going to satisfy you, because, well, I think, but like it's not going to be specific enough for you to sit there and say, okay, we're saving 30,000 here. So it's very general, because again, we're looking across, 50 or 60 service areas and departments and all that sort of stuff that effectively have trimmed things by $5,000 or $10,000 and all that sort of stuff. So it's not necessary. I've tried to quantify as much as I can, and I've tried to pick up the big ticket items, and I'll demonstrate that as we go through tonight. But if you want specifics in some of the things, I'm not in a position to answer that, and just ask Erin and Renee of all the questions that I've been asking, and they've been saying, yeah, well, because again, people have just looked at their budget as a whole and said, oh, okay, well, I think I can deliver this with $10,000 less than what I actually delivered with it, or I didn't actually spend this $10,000 that I had in my budget, so I'll give it up. So that's pretty much the scenario.
I was just going to say, Sharon has produced, well, I think they're pretty good, but I think Sharon's produced some graphs which will give you a high level of comfort about the broad components. There's probably one key area that we've probably driven $150,000 of saving, and that's where we've had staff that have asked to work, so they're working 5 days a week and they've asked us to work 4 or 3. We've actually decided that we'll no longer backfill those days that they've decided to forego. So we're delivering, I'd argue, the same service with less hours, and we've been disciplined to say we're not going to bring in casuals or backfill them. So we've actually hard-coded that in the budget this time to say we're going to have a discipline around that, which I think is the organisation to commend it for, because that means the team are working harder. And then one area which you'll be particularly interested in is there was a $75,000, roughly $70,000 saving with our purchase of our electricity by going to the power purchase agreement that now it's still getting negotiated, but that'll lock in 1 July. And indicatively, we've gone a little bit conservative, but we believe we'll save at a minimum $70,000 just in our purchase of our power. So that's just 2 key components which really have helped us towards that 3.5%. Yeah.
All right, so current draft budget, and I'll sit there and say that we're still reviewing this budget. So, we had a time frame to actually present tonight. So currently, the first line is from a recurrent perspective. So we adopted a operating deficit from our recurrent operations. So that's our delivery of our parks, our libraries, our all the stock standard things that we do. We think that we'll actually have us come in under that at 1.1 or $1.2 million deficit. The long-term financial plan that we adopted back in September or October? November. Seems so long ago. Said that from recurrent operations, we were forecasting a $120,000 operating surplus. Our draft budget at this point in time is saying that we will deliver, we're aiming for a operating surplus of $247,000. So that's where our starting point. Obviously from that, we actually take our new initiatives off of that. And that's basically the budget. So the figure that I've put in here for illustrative purposes for tonight is the funding submissions that staff have actually put forward. As an executive team, we haven't actually reviewed them yet. We're actually going to review them tomorrow. And then we've got the session on the 4th of March, which we will present the funding submissions, which basically the initiatives and capital ones that we recommend that we actually include in our annual business plan or our program for the next 12 months.
Can I just jump in there for a second, yes. Sharon? Just to share about the new initiatives. So the executive team had a first blush on the staff's wish list. And to be fair to the staff, we've already cut what we felt were a few items out of there to bring it in at 754. But the team have actually indicated that they believe there's more that we can gain and perhaps not put up so many initiatives. So as Sharon has said, it will now effectively be our second cut, but this is the real hard line cut. I'm not sure what the number will be, but it should come in a bit less than that, ideally.
Yep. So I suppose our starting position is actually quite positive. And, you know, as I said back when the audit committee put the challenge out there, I told them that essentially it was a very audacious goal. And again, I think that the organisation and the staff should actually be commended for actually doing putting forward that as their first draft. But as I said, we are continuing to look through it. So just to break it down into, I suppose, the elements. So it is based on a 6% rate revenue increase, plus the 2% growth that we're anticipating getting from new assessments. So we've just for this purpose, we've actually just applied the percentage that's been included in the long-term financial plan that's been adopted. User fees and statutory charges is probably a bit down on the adopted the long-term financial plan, but that's driven by that we knew that there was a bit of a budgeting error, like so the base for user fees and statutory charges was overstated as that forecasting in the long-term financial plan. However, we may still see some uplifts, so unfortunately with the statutory charges, that's actually determined most of that is actually determined by increases that the state government put through, because a lot of them are the legislative changes. So, and the state government doesn't release their budget until May, so there may be some uplift there. Grants and subsidies, we have assumed.
The Reserve Bank reviewed the interest rate.
Yep.
4.1.
Yep, I saw that as I was leaving. So at the moment, from an investment income, we're never going to get anything more because we don't actually have any spare cash lying around to invest. Essentially, we just keep a little bit of money in our trading account, but potentially that will actually have some impact on our finance costs. But until we actually develop the whole budget, I can't determine what the impact of that is. Yes, Brian.
Thanks, Sharon. If you go back to the previous slide, one of the questions I'd like to ask there, in Gawler, as you know, so many of the roads we get told all the time, it's not ours, it's the state government. But our staff fill the potholes and do what's broken on those roads. Do we get compensated for that?
I'll hand that over to Wendy because she will be better from an operational perspective as to what happens.
So no, I can confirm that when it's a state road, we refer those issues onto the state government, so DIT, and their employed contractor comes and fills them. So when there's a pothole on 12th Street, that is DIT's contractor Downer that comes and fills them. You know, we are very firm in not doing work on roads that are not ours.
So with grants and so majority of this income is actually the financial assistance grants that we actually get through from the state, federal government. We've increased that by about 5%. There might actually be, again, there might be some uplift on that because over the last couple of years, our share of the allocation has actually been greater than that, the stock standard 5%. So the way the money gets distributed is on a very complicated formula that's based on, you know, the amount of roads that you have, your population, your ageing, and all that sort of stuff. So, so there may be some uplift there. We have assumed, as we always do, that irrespective of the timing of the receipt of the cash, we will get equivalent of 4 quarters of the financial assistance grants. We're not going to do this to sit there and say, you know, because they always advance it. However, this year why they advanced it, they missed it by a day, so, you know, who knows. But we just assume that we will always have 4. And again, it is just a pure one-day timing issue. It doesn't actually impact anything from that perspective. And other revenue is just bits and pieces that's very minor in that. So there might be some uplift, but we probably just need to wait for a bit more information on from our state and federal government before we can actually determine that. So this is one of my graphs that I did. Hopefully it makes sense. What I wanted to try and communicate here is, oh, and I forgot to fix up that bloody thing. It's 1.78 million, it's not 1.1 trillion increase, it's only a $1.7 million increase. All right, just, I forgot to do that. I've been told about 6 times to change it and I completely forgot. So I tried to actually demonstrate how, I suppose, what elements are of the increase that there are actually. So we always start off with our rates that we actually generated this year. And then what we've actually got is that we've got a cost indexation. So that's actually just the increase in the cost to actually deliver the services that we actually do. So that equates to about $1.4 million. And then we've actually got, we have the impact of, so we've done a whole heap of capital works, we've got new assets, we've been gifted assets. So the following year we've got a depreciation impact. We've introduced new services or we've got new maintenance things. So we actually have we sort of sit there and say that we try and raise about, in this instance, it's around about 1.5%. That actually equates for, I suppose, the life cycle or the maintenance costs associated with those new things. Helen, you will get a copy of it on the hub, so you don't need to. Okay, yep. Then we give a bit away in our rebates. Again, we probably give around about, I think it's about $2.5 million in rebates. So obviously, as our rate revenue increases, the amount of rebates that we actually give away also increases. And the majority of those rebates are either mandatory rebates that we have to give under the Act or our Section 158 adjustment that we provide to our commercial ratepayers. So realistically, from general rate revenue, general rate revenue will increase by around the net, around, if I can do my math right, about $1.6 million. And so that's essentially what we need to collect from our existing ratepayers and all that sort of stuff, and then that essentially gets spread across. Then with new assessments, so these are new properties, that adding to the increase of our rateable properties, 2% of last year's revenue, so we probably expect around about $600,000 from that. So our general rate revenue is expected to be around 34 million. Put my glasses on, I can see. And then on top of that, we have our separate rates. So our 2 separate rates that we actually have is our Gawler Business Development Group levy. Well, it's not actually Gawler Business Development Group levy, but I can't remember what it's called. And then regional landscape levy. So the regional landscape levy is a pass-through cost. I do need to check that number. I don't think that increase has actually been significantly is high enough from that perspective. So, but majority of that separate rate is from the regional landscape levy. So whatever we collect, we pass through to the state government anyway. So it doesn't have any impact on our bottom line. And the last one is our waste charge. So we charge that as a fixed, as service fee on top of. That's driven by the NORMA budget, which is subject to change because we haven't actually received their final budget yet. And so the amount of their service fees is, that they on charge to us is determined by their budget. So while we are sort of indicating that we think that we'll get around 34 million, some of those elements are subject to change. I've done the same with user fees and statutory charges, so I've combined them together. So I would sit there and say, one of the things is with our user fees and statutory charges, I would sit there and say that they're relatively flat. So what I'm actually comparing it as the movement to is from our revised budget. We did have an issue, a long-standing issue with one of the tenants in GAC, the admin centre, which we actually had to provide a credit. And so that credit is actually in the revised forecast. And so hence that's why the lease fees is actually going up. Looks like it's going up by heaps, but it isn't actually. It's just basically the normalisation because of that credit that we had to pay that's included in this year's numbers. So the other two areas that are mainly going up is in relation to our parking. You know that we're actually trialling the LRPX, which is the licence recognition system, and that's actually just making it easier for us to actually cover more of the controlled parking areas, which previously we couldn't do when we were actually doing that on foot. And then health control services. So this is another thing that we've actually done as well and changed the way that we're actually thinking, is that what we're actually doing is that, especially with Adelaide Plains, the smaller councils, Adelaide Plains and Light, we're actually providing health control services to them. So we've got the so we're I suppose, making our existing resources work a bit harder, and we're actually providing services to those councils, and they're actually paying for those services as well. So, those are the sorts of things that that we're doing, and we're changing our mindset and looking at the ways that we can utilise and benefit from that. And pretty much everything else is. So I would sit there and say that from a fees perspective, it's relatively flat in our income from year on year. But again, it's just such a small portion of our overall budget. But again, it's one of those areas that if we actually want to try and reduce our dependency on rate revenue, we have to probably have a different thinking about how we charge or for the use of our facilities that we actually make available to the community. Because fundamentally, if we don't charge the user groups that are using the facilities, the rest of the community is actually subsidising that, because we have to actually recover the cost of that as well. So that's probably one thing of that we need to think. Yes, Paul? Can you pull that?
Could you just explain what those little red things are? The red
So
squares?
the red is so basically the way the graph works. So it's starting at the revised budget. The green one is actually increasing, and the red ones have actually come back, so they're actually less than.
Revised budget, the original budget.
Yeah. So essentially, yeah, the revised budget, which has just been adopted by, will be adopted by council on next week. The total income for the Sports and Aquatic Centre is actually less than what we've actually, for next year, is less than what we've actually had for the previous year. So it's Green is good, red is bad. Right?
Sharon, yeah, I understood what the answer, thanks very much for that, what Paul asked. But when, just recently we heard a very professional explanation of the costs and the income that was coming into the Sport and Recreation Centre. Well, it's the first I've ever heard about that, and I was fascinated by those figures that were put forward. When it comes to the point of doing a budget or whatever, that doesn't actually come to us as elected members. It goes to the senior managers who then accept that as a budget bid. Is that the way I understand it? In other words, put it in layman's terms. Say, for instance, now, all of a sudden the Visitor Information Centre has asked for another $10,000 in their budget next year. Who then looks into the cost of running the centre, the income, and expenditure and all that sort of stuff before they approve that, or is that done by the senior manager of that department? That makes sense? I don't know.
So it's probably a combination. So in first instance, it's actually the manager that's responsible for the area. Then it would go up to David, then it would come up to us, an executive, and then it would actually go to, obviously, council, because council is the one that adopts. By virtue of you adopting the budget, you're sitting there saying, okay, so you're confirming the decisions of previously. And I think that's... so it's probably a number of people that actually go through that process to sit there and say that if we need to increase, the approval process is multifaceted as well. But I think as your role of council is not necessarily to get into the nitty-gritty of what's the individual budgets and the components and all that sort of stuff. You know, that's what I suppose in the first instance you employ Chris for, to make sure, and then Chris employs the people that need to do that, and we do that interrogation before it comes to you, and we feel comfortable actually that it is a fair and reasonable response. But ultimately, you're the decision maker, and if you don't agree with us, you can say, no, we want you to go back and do more, or we don't want you to do this anymore, or anything like that. And some of that sort of stuff will actually come out of potentially once we actually start doing those service reviews and understanding which areas of the business we should actually be looking at, you know, because it is, again, thing of there's things that we have to do that we're required to do by legislation, so we can't get rid of those services, but we can look at them and see how we can actually do it more efficiently. So they might not be valued, but we want to, if something's not valued but we have to do it, we want to make sure that we actually deliver that service as at the lowest cost in the most efficient way, and those sorts of things that are come out of those service reviews, which I suppose is that part of that structural change that I talked about that would be required for us to actually start looking at over the next 12 months, so we're actually in a position to actually, I suppose, make some of those decisions and embed some of those decisions that we've actually into our budget going forward. As I said, just grant and subsidies. So we just basically have a stock standard funding stream that comes from state or federal government. So it's the financial assistance grants, supplementary road funding, which we actually get because South Australia gets not enough of the pool for the amount of roads that we're actually required to maintain. And then we have some home assist for our home assist services, and then we have a library grant. One of the other elements is that we also get roads to recovery funding, and because of a quirk in the accounting standards, we have to treat that as operating income, but we actually use it to assist funding our capital works program. So when we're actually making decisions about what we should actually rate our community, we actually do take that away, because if we included it in our operating result, what we would actually end up doing is that would be ending up not collecting enough income or having enough income to actually deliver the services that we actually want to do. Yep, Paul?
Just on the home assist, isn't that in flux at the moment about who's going to, the funding arrangements around that?
I'll pass that over to Dave because he's more across it than I am.
Yes, so the latest information is that we have funding allocations through to 30 June 2027, whilst the federal government still work through what they're going to do in the aged care sector and considerations around implementing schemes such as an NDIS for aged care that is still ongoing. We only have officially received an agreement in the last couple of weeks that we've sent back for execution that gives that 2-year funding.
It's been in flux for ages.
It's been in flux for at least 15 years.
It's been an annual cycle, so this is the longest agreement we've actually had for about 15 years, and it's 2 years. Yeah.
So over to the expenses. So obviously this is where there's going to be the biggest inroads, and this is where the structural change. Again, we probably do need some bit of a structural change with our user fees and how we approach to user fees. But again, it's just a small component. It's actually not necessarily like it will have. It will go to some way, but it's really the expenses that we've actually done. So this is where we actually have really scrutinised the budget. And as Chris said, with regard to, obviously, we're a service provider. So unfortunately, the way you provide services is with people. So we do have people, and if we want to continue to provide the services, we don't make anything, so we're not going to have a... so it's around about, I think it's, so it's about a 50-50 split from that operating expenses. And we've got around about 143 FTEs to deliver the services that we actually deliver. So obviously from a indexation perspective, we're governed by the enterprise agreement. We've just finished renegotiating those agreements last year, and we've actually, so the increase, wage increase for this year is 3.25%. And then we've also got the last year of the super guarantee increasing, so hopefully it stays at 12%. Hasn't heard anything like that. So those are two givens that we actually have to build into it. And again, as Chris, one of the decisions, so we do, as an organisation, we do have a lot of family-friendly policies and flexible working arrangements. So there are a number of staff that for family needs who actually do hold substantive positions, so full-time positions, have actually asked to actually go part-time. So in the past, in the budget process, we've held that. Those little bits and pieces, it equates to around about 1 FTE. We've had that. This year we've said, actually, no, what we're actually going to do is that we're going to, for the next 12 months, those people, because we know that, because the way the arrangements are is that people are on a 12-month agreement, which is actually reviewed annually. So we're actually going to sort of sit there and say, actually, no, we don't need that money. We've been delivering the services. And a lot of these positions are actually back office positions. I think 3 of them are actually in my department. So we're still doing what we actually need to do, and all that sort of stuff. So we won't backfill those. And again, every organisation has turnover. Our turnover is around about 10%. Again, in the past, we've sort of, you always work on that utopia that you'll always have a full complement of staff for the whole year, which never happens. So what we've actually done is that we've actually built in an allowance. It is I suppose it is a risk component of the budget, because, heaven forbid that we don't get any turnover. That is a risk, but it's a risk that we're prepared to take because we know that that's actually a case. However, we have also worked on the assumption that with frontline, so in determining that turnover allowance, we've actually said we've excluded frontline staff from that because we know any frontline staff we will backfill. So it's those positions that we believe that we can cope outside the recruitment phase to actually deliver on that. And then and some of the stuff as well is to sit there and say, so we've got some situations where we're actually changing, we have some vacancies, and so we've actually changed the way we're actually going to deal with those vacancies for the first for this year. So we've taken them out of labour and put them into material. So it's actually a better reflection. So hopefully this year we're not always reporting every month that we've got this variance in labour because of vacancies. You know, hopefully we've had enough years of knowledge and basis of what we actually think that turnover is, that some of that variance reporting won't actually be happening. Materials and contracts, and that's where the 3.5% savings target was built into the long-term financial plan. So I would sit there, I'm pretty happy with the $71,000 variance to the long-term financial plan. I would sit there and say that we've nailed it. And again, this is there are some dependencies in the delivery of that number. So there will be some funding submissions that have actually come to you to ask for new plant and equipment. And without that plant and equipment, some of these operational savings that we have built into the budget, in predominantly in Wendy's area, in the operations area, it's sitting there saying, okay, we can do our job more efficiently and not hire equipment if we actually buy it. And so we've built those savings in that number, but when the project submissions come and you sit there and say, nah, we're not going to spend that, potentially there may be an offset in that. But in those areas, we've clearly articulated that within the arrangement or within the bid. Again, it's the power purchasing agreement. We've changed the purchasing model for our electricity. Previously, we used to just basically go with a bulk LGA. Now we've actually got together with 6 other councils, and we're actually doing a individual agreement outside the LGA procurement. And the reason why we're doing it, not only does it actually provide ourselves savings, it also complements and delivers on our climate action plan, because we actually have a high renewable component, and we can guarantee that, I suppose, we are sourcing electricity from renewable areas, rather than the comment that, oh yeah, it's renewable, but we don't actually know where it's being sourced from. So yes, there's a savings, but there was also the environmental impact of it. Again, we've looked at different alternative delivery models, and we've reviewed unused budgets and said, okay, well, we haven't used it. What's changed this year to make sure that you're going to use it, and all that sort of stuff as well. So finance costs, just put it in there as the long-term financial plan at this point in time, because it is dependent on what we actually do for the capital works program. And yes, fortunately, with the Reserve Bank reducing interest rates, and hopefully they reduce another one. And we are fortunate using LGFA as a lender, because they will pass on the full interest rate cut, so they always do, unlike other banks, which I think the market's sort of saying that the other banks will pass on the full drop this time, but next time they won't. So they'll do the right thing the first time round, but second and third they'll say, no, we need to recover some profits, so we'll keep that. Depreciation is always the biggest unknown. To be honest, again, because we don't know, while we sort of have an indication of what sort of assets are going to be gifted to us from developers, some years we can get lots, some years we can get nothing, and it's a bit of guesswork as to what our new asset base is. And again, and from that perspective, and also over the last couple of years, even though there's been a lot more stability over the last couple of years in the pricing, we haven't seen those price fluctuations, but that has actually caused some issues in the base. The other thing that I will note here is that I haven't included the non-cash component of the regional subsidiaries. Again, we don't have the budget for them, and it is a non-cash item. It's just a reporting thing that we have to do from a standards perspective. It doesn't necessarily, while it will have an impact on our bottom line, I don't believe, because of the non-cash and a reporting thing, that we should be taking into account any of those impacts when we're actually making decisions about what to rate our community. So that's why I've actually excluded it. And I've tried to do exactly the same thing with employee expenses. So obviously I'm starting again from our revised position. So our revised position compared to our budget actually incorporates some vacancies. So obviously we need to actually have the EA increase, and then we need to actually build back the full year impact of having some of those vacancies as well. That we've actually got now. That's not included in the base. The superannuation increase from 11.5% to 12%. Yep, Paul?
Back to this not recruiting if somebody leaves. We've been doing that a lot anyway, haven't we? Each year we've been reporting on that.
We do recruit. It's just that we actually...
but this is not the first time we've actually included that in the budget.
Well, I know for the last couple of years it hasn't been included in the budget.
I'm sure it has.
I'm sure it hasn't because I've done the last two budgets.
Yeah.
So,
Because I remember.
I think that there was 1 year where the EA increase was greater than what we actually budgeted for when we actually had the EA increases linked to CPI, and a decision was that we wouldn't recruit to, we wouldn't recruit any vacant positions. We put a recruitment freeze on to actually account for the difference between what we'd actually build into the budget and what we actually had to pay. So you may have done it before my time, but I know in the last couple of years, the last couple of budgets that we've done, it hasn't been incorporated in. It hasn't been incorporated.
Okay, I do remember it.
Yeah, as I said, it's probably not. It's before my time, if that's the case. So the last couple of budgets haven't incorporated, but we do recruit. We haven't. It's not a recruitment freeze, it's just the fact that there's a gap, and it's actually recognising that, in an ideal world, everyone resigns and you get 4 weeks notice and you're never going to recruit anyone in 4 weeks. So, and recognising that while some positions we will backfill, we don't backfill everyone, and all that sort of stuff as well. And again, obviously when we saw the budget and the depreciation impact, and that's one of the decisions that we actually made about the fact of we're going to forego some of those bits of pieces, bits of people, to offset that as well. So, and that actually equates to around about 1 FTE. To bring it back to the...
Great, I understood that. And you said about the recruitment and all that sort of stuff. For a long time, I've seen it and I've often thought that there is fantastic staff that work here, part of the 139. And I know other councillors, I won't say who they are, and all that sort of thing, feel the same way. When do some of those staff step up or take on a little bit more and so forth? Because the staff that I know, when I was employed here for 5 years and that sort of stuff, I quite often thought, well, hang on, why are they all there? And then, no, it's not for me to ask those questions and so forth. But do the staff get the opportunity to step up?
Yes. So from Renee's a classic example. So there was a vacancy when Lakesh left. Again, I provided an opportunity for I put it to my team to sit there and say, who wants to step into the role and want to have an opportunity? Renee stepped into that role on a secondment basis to see if she liked it and to see if that's what she wanted, and it went well. So yes, from an organisation perspective, we do, I suppose I encourage that, and from that perspective, but cognizant of sometimes some people actually don't want to do it. You know, Erin's a classic example of that as well. You know, very good employees that could probably got the ability to do it, but they just choose not to because that's not what they want to do. So, yes, and I know that Wendy's done just recently with her team, provided those opportunities to step up and have a go in more senior roles before we actually go out and recruit. And I think most departments actually do that. We do encourage that because obviously the best candidate you can recruit for a job is someone from internal because you actually know who they are. You know what you're getting, and then we try and backfill. I suppose we recruit at that lower level, and all again because obviously the philosophy is that if we can retain staff, it's actually a lot better. Because we don't have to actually, rather than actually having to go out because of the recruitment costs and all that sort of stuff as well. So they do get opportunities. Whether they choose to take them or not I suppose, is up to them as an individual.
That is done by the senior manager.
The leadership team, and the recommendations on that as well. And again. I don't know how many people know, so Victoria, who's just had a baby, so we did the same thing, is that we provide an opportunity to one of the other staff members in the team. So we've backfilled from internal, and the position at the end is the one that we've actually, at the bottom is the one that we've actually backfilled rather than not having those opportunities for people as well.
Equally so, Brian, the community expects that all positions here are thrown open so that the very best, applicants can apply, and a local person will definitely have an advantage, a council member, fresh an organisation and bring new skills and ideas in. So it's a bit of a fine balance.
I don't think you could ever have a completely closed ship because someone's left, so you have to bring that new blood in, and again, and it is appropriate. If there wasn't anyone here, we do that assessment on the organisational needs as well. In relation to materials, so again, some of the operational savings are dependent on the funding submissions, both the initiatives, so operating initiatives, but also capital projects being endorsed. So if the council doesn't support what we think is a good idea, we will have to make some adjustments to that. And the cost reduction, again, has been achieved through the different model for electricity and just basically looking at what we do, how we do it, and what it actually costs and how we can actually fund it. So some of the big ticket items that I've come out. So again, anything red is bad, so we're actually increasing the cost. Well, it's not necessarily bad, but these are where we've actually increased, and then the areas where we've actually introduced some savings. So building maintenance, again, building maintenance is probably a bit of a symptom of probably some of the lack of investment into our buildings, our building facilities, but also it's a reflection on, a bit of what's actually happening out in the community. So building maintenance covers the vandalism charges, costs, of what we're actually experiencing in the community. So if we could wipe all those sorts of unreasonable element out of the community, we would be in a position to do to reduce that. Street light maintenance. Unfortunately, we have to pay SAPN and DIT a contribution to the street light maintenance. we don't really have any control over the cost. They tell us how much it is and we pay it. Contractors is across the whole. So this is existing contracts that we actually might have. So, for example, our cleaning contract is one. Some of the operational, in the operational areas, like weed spraying, we might contract out street sweeping, and all those essential services that essentially we have contracts associated with them, and there's stock standard annual increases included in those agreements. And this is another area that potentially is going to be looking at from a service review perspective, is that we can review a service and accept that we should be doing it as in-source versus outsource, but if it's attached, if there's already a contract that we've entered into that's got a couple of years to go, we're sort of trapped. Yes, Paul.
So with the contractors, you're saying we're going to have an increase of $153,000 next year. Is that right?
On top of our revised budget.
Okay. But is that more than just CPI?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I'll get back to you.
Okay.
I'll get back to you.
So
I can't remember what the base is of contractors, but again, some of those arrangements they've got review clauses, and they may have higher than CPI review rate increases in them. So a lot of that expenses that's actually under that contractors is there's a underlying document associated with that as well. So I don't know if Wendy wants to add anything more, because...
Well, the reality is that 153,000 is a lot better than it was going to be, because we've done that zero-based budgeting and actually taken out a lot of the pre-existing contractor costs that have gone in over the years. So we've actually already stripped that back. A lot of that is allocated to the contracted increase in costs. I'll have to go back and have a look if there's a couple new ones. I know that we have, for example, done a lot of work in our building maintenance space, where a lot of stuff was going to unplanned maintenance, and we've actually gone through that now with a fine-tooth comb and said, well, what actually should be planned and what could go into contract, and that would be reflected in there as well. So again, there's been a lot of work to actually try and manage that cost.
Well, I'll get back to you as to what the actual percentage increase is. Utilities, basically, this is so we have had some savings on our street lighting, because that's where the main savings that we're actually going to get from the entering into the procurement, the power purchasing agreement, is the savings are actually going to be delivered from our street lighting, and so then we've still got some small contracts that we're at the mercy of high increasing electricity charges as well. And also water, so water's in that utilities as well, again. And then we've got some minor movements where it's like, $1,000 over, 15 different lines, and all that sort of stuff. So some savings, electricity from our street lighting, savings in the waste disposal. So, but again, potentially that might change, but then that's an in and out. It shouldn't necessarily, it shouldn't have an impact on the bottom line, because we recover our waste disposal costs through our service charge. And this is one of the other areas that we actually looked at, and it is that thing about this line about better utilisation of our internal skills, knowledge and experience, rather than actually picking the phone, the first instinct of picking the phone up, of speaking to a consultant or someone like that. It's like we've got the expertise in-house, so we actually make sure, back our own judgment from that perspective. So we've really looked at our legal costs, we've really looked at our use of consultants and all that sort of stuff, as well as to sit there and say, and again, going back to Brian's comment, you know, that's another way we actually get the ability for our staff to step up. And, you know, we might not get them, they might not have the opportunity to step into a higher role, but they have that opportunity to, I suppose, utilise their skills and experience for what we employ them for in a different way than what they've actually had in the past. So, and again, just generally, just reviewing, just basically being really really hard. You know, Erin and Renee and Victoria have done really good. You know, the organisation probably hates seeing them, thinking, you know, they're not taking the excuses anymore. They're really challenging as to sit there and say, okay, well, do you really need that? You know, do you really mean that? That doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that. You know, so it is, again, it's just that bit of that cultural change and cultural shift. Did you have a question? No? No? Oh, I knew someone had a hand up.
Yeah. So just, you mentioned the water, and that seems to be one that might fluctuate a lot more than the other utilities based on just the weather and that sort of thing. Just wondering if there's anything you can...
And again, it's also the thing is to sit there and say most of the assets that we get are roads and parks from a development perspective. So a lot of that might be just the fact that we anticipate that we're going to be watering for a longer period. But again, and also it is some of the impact of the fact that we've actually got more parks that we now have to water. And again, the community nowadays expects to see a green park, even though they know from their own experience of looking at their own garden that there's been no rain coming out of the sky, no water out of the sky, but they will still expect a nice green reserve with no brown bits and all that sort of stuff as well, you know. I do have to feel for Wendy's guys and all that sort of stuff to try and keep those reserves green without killing the water bill from that perspective as well.
I think one of the key points, just like to share, a lot of the staff were worried that if they trim their budgets back too much, they wouldn't have any capacity to respond to emergencies or unknown situations. And we actually had a good conversation to say, don't worry about that. If it arises, that's when we're coming to have a conversation with council. So we're budgeting on our best known information. And yes, I'm sure that we've still got a little bit of flexibility in there, which is okay. But a lot of the larger contingency buckets have come out, knowing full well that, heaven forbid, we have whether it's a flood or trees come down or something. That's when we'll come back to council and have a conversation about the impact of that, rather than having provisions that we may never utilise and effectively rating our community for things that may not happen. That was the approach that we've talked to the organisation about.
Yeah, and I would sit there and say that, you know, again, there's probably still a little bit of risk in there, like risk buffer, but there probably isn't it. Like, you know, we haven't budgeted for, what happens if there's a flood? What happens if there's a bad storm? What happens if this happens? What happens if there's a fire? So those what ifs have probably actually been stripped out. And again, but I suppose as a council, but as a community, they need to understand that if that happens, we will respond, and we will, and that will mean that's the reason why if we haven't achieved what we said that we were going to deliver on, the reason is that we've either redirected our resources to respond, to provide a community response which is expected of us, or we've still delivered what we said that we're going to do, plus we've actually responded to the community's the disaster or the unknown that we wouldn't expect and that you don't really want to budget for because you don't want it to happen.
Just to clarify, there's not a contingency budget anymore, is that what you're saying? You just reallocate funds from a different area if there's a flood or a fire or something. Is that what you're saying?
No.
So, if I may, sorry, Sharon. That's correct, there's no more contingencies. And it'll be a triage approach. So if it's a smaller issue, we'll first look within the organisation, within existing budgets, to work out whether we can take a bit from here and put it over there, to have a zero bottom line. And day to day, the staff will do that generally anyway, and we'll have those conversations as management. But if we have a larger event, which is going to have a significant impact, we'll come back to council and have a conversation and make some recommendations. It may not always be asking for more money. It might be saying, look, we recommend that we pull some money from over here, which may have impact on another service delivery, but that'll be council's decision. Or, absolute worst case, and let's hope it never happens, we might say, we were budgeting for a surplus and, sorry, we're going to have to go into a bit of a deficit because we've got to deal with an issue. They're the couple of scenarios. Well, no, we don't. This is talking about budgeting for a surplus.
But our debt is growing. It's more than...
Yeah,
Our debt's up here something.
but that doesn't mean that we have a deficit.
No, but I think... Yeah, but let's think about it. So before we can address the debt, we've got to produce a surplus, because a surplus is how you pay that down. So our primary focus here needs to be producing a surplus. So best case scenario, and then the ideal scenario is this year effectively at zero, or a very minor surplus. This is the year that sets us up for the future years where we're producing ongoing surpluses to pay down that debt that ideally we don't want as high as it is now. Yep.
The long-term financial plan, you don't actually pay the debt off to 9 years down the track, where you pay off $9 million.
Yep.
That's the long-term
But Paul, we don't have to pay down all debt. Debt is not bad.
No, but the debt only is paid off in 9 years' time when you pay off $9 million.
So,
That's what's in the plan.
so the way I look at that is, so we've got a long-term plan that says we'll do X, Y and Z. Essentially though, you reassess it every year. So it might be that when we get to next year, just assume, for example, we produce a surplus and council says, look, instead of sitting on that, we want to pay down our debt quicker, and the council can make some decisions about how fast it pays down that debt. But before we can do that, we've got to focus on generating consistent surplus.
Well, yeah, I get that, but I just think with the contingency, will you be taking it out of a capital project for that financial year instead of finding out the debt?
So I wouldn't focus too much on this contingency concept. All I was trying to demonstrate really was that because I've asked the staff to really hone in what the true cost of delivering the service is, there's probably less ability for us to deal with shocks than we might have had in the system. Now, fingers crossed and all things being equal, we hope we don't get those shocks. I guess I'm just preempting, there may be a point where we come back to council and say, look, something absolutely unknown has happened, we need you to know about it, and this is how we're planning on dealing with it, and maybe we need some extra money from council. Just preempting that future conversation, which hopefully never happens.
I think to use as an example, as we don't have our emergency fund anymore. So if you at home, I don't know, my mum has all this, she has a bank account which is her emergency money. She doesn't touch it and all that sort of stuff, and that if something breaks that she's unplanned, she will dip into that emergency fund. Within the existing budget and within our expenditure budgets, we don't have that emergency fund, which potentially could have been, whether it was consciously or subconsciously, I suspect it's probably more subconsciously, because people are risk averse, and they didn't want to, they probably didn't feel comfortable of having to come back and saying, oh, actually, I need some more money because something that I didn't plan for actually happened. So save me from actually having that conversation. I'll just have this little bit of emergency funding here, so I don't have to do that. So I think that's where we're saying it's those emergency funds that probably over time have been built into budget, and everyone does it. It's human nature, and all that sort of stuff as well. So those ones are the pockets that have been reviewed. So again, if again, if we have another flood and that we have a sinkhole or something like that, you know, we don't have some money in our back pocket that we can pull out now to sort of sit there and say to fund it. So, yeah. But that's also a good thing, because that's what we want to actually encourage the leadership team and our team members and all that sort of stuff, is to sit there and say, we don't know everything, and it is okay. You know, if something hasn't gone right, as long as we can as long as there's a justification for and a reason as to why we forgot it or why we weren't aware of it because we didn't know that it was going to rain all of a sudden, that's okay. It's okay to actually come forward. You don't necessarily think it's that increase in that transparency. You're not going to get wrapped over the knuckles, or you're not going to get told off because you didn't actually get it right 18 months before. You are incurring their cost, because that's realistically what we're actually asking staff to do, is actually think about what they're going to need probably potentially 12 months before they actually need it, I think.
Yeah, just a question to clarify. I guess when that funding has, that emergency funding has been set aside, where has that gone in recent years? Is that something which has just sort of rolled over and it's been a saving, or is it something which perhaps, like the lawyers and consultants, which were a bit, perhaps may have been a bit fast to
I can't answer that question as to where it's gone, but potentially it is to sit there and say that we've over-delivered. You know, we've had the higher operating surplus or something like that, or we've decided something's come up and it's just automatically been allocated to it. I'm not in a position to sit there and say where has that gone, because I don't know. Because realistically, you don't know where all those little and those buckets could be $2,000.
Yeah.
Like it's not like it's a big stash of cash that we're talking about. It's just like, you know, little bits of $2,000 here, $2,000 there, and it might be some things as to sit there and say, I'd really like to do this, and so I'll put some money in the budget for it, but they just haven't got to it because maybe another emergency's come up or something like that. So to actually quantify where those buckets have gone, needless to say that we've been spending more than what we've actually been bringing in income over the last few years. So I suspect it's probably gone out somewhere. I don't know. Yeah. We've spent it.
So I assume it would be different for every team as to what happens with it. But I guess, if I've got this right, there's no hard and fast sort of rules around what that can be. So what I was trying to establish is it set apart as a separate contingency thing which can just only be used for emergencies, or so somehow it managed to creep back into the expenditure because, it would be nice to have this extra thing, and so we got some money here because we didn't have any emergencies and then draw it in.
I think probably the best way I can process it is, before we did the discipline of going to the zero budgeting concept where you start from first principles and build the budget back up, if you think about what happens just say you had your budget and every year you just applied CPI, it's really lazy budgeting. No criticism, it's what a lot of organisations do. But in that approach, you inevitably get fat built into the system. And so it's not called a contingency fund. It just means your budget has grown perhaps more than you actually needed over time.
So this is pretty much the last slide. So again, just to summarise, so the focus has been on that expenditure control. It has been we have really honed in. You know, zero-based budgeting has probably been a thing for this organisation for a few years, but we haven't been disciplined to actually implement it. This year we really did. We really honed in to sit there and say, no, you have to start from first principles and all that sort of stuff. You know, consideration was given to how services were delivered. Is there any potential efficiencies? Are we doing things the same way we've done them for the last 10 years? Can we do it differently? You know, so it is just changing the way that people were thinking about how we can actually deliver our services. We have exceeded the recurrent budget forecast that's actually set out in the long-term financial plan. We are budgeting at this point in time for a surplus of $250,000, which is up 100. So we're 100,000 ahead from this starting point.
I just want to spend a moment and ask selected members just to reflect on that for a minute. If you think about where we're coming from, so a deficit of 1.5 or 6 in this current year.
1.7.
It's a 1.7 million deficit, and we're now looking at turning around to 100-odd thousand surplus. So in a 12-month period, we're turning around $1.89 million. That's where, obviously, yes, there's a rate rise in there, but it's not $2 million, it's not $1.9 million. And that's how I get a level of comfort about the cost that had to come out of the organisation to achieve that. Yeah, and I guess I should go on record, and I just need to thank Sharon and her team, well, and the whole organisation actually, because whilst I think I got worried at the start when I said we're going to try and aim for a zero bottom line, and I know I got a few funny looks, worried looks, but they accepted the challenge, and the organisation then got on board, and I'm not going to say it was easy, because it wasn't easy, but we produced a result without anyone losing any fingernails, and
Not yet.
anyone losing too much sleep. So I'm really proud of what the organisation's managed to put before you. It's in the future sessions where we'll get in the nitty-gritty and we'll talk about borrowings, capital works and specific projects. That's where it gets really interesting. But at this level, it's an excellent place to start from.
Yep. And if you asked me 12 months ago, I would have said no hope. I was I was managing expectations very well, but I was managing mine as well, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, it is a big turnaround, and again, and it is that different thinking, and all that sort of stuff, and I think I suppose the benefit of it is that probably this time last year, when we were setting that foundation of something, this is what we need to do, and it's going to be, it's not necessarily going to be an easy task. Obviously, we still have to deliver it from that perspective as well. But I think that I suppose the change and the support of the organisation actually provides me comfort that we will actually we will be in a position to deliver it as well. Again, I suppose, there is some things that we have preempted some of the funding submissions of getting up, because we believe that fundamentally, and it goes back down to, I suppose, the discussions that we had when we were doing the long-term financial plan, is unless we actually spend some money renewing our investing in our roads and investing in some infrastructure, we need to spend that money. We will never make those savings that we actually need to make from a recurrent operation perspective. We won't be able to do the structural changes that we need to do to actually make sure that we can sustainably and ongoing deliver an operating surplus. So that might not necessarily sit well with some people, but fundamentally that's one of the things that's what we actually need to do. Because if we don't invest in like our civil infrastructure, our maintenance team, while they're good, they're not going to be that good that they can't actually deliver the savings or deliver the reduction in the maintenance costs if they're still having to repair stuff that really needs to be replaced. That scenario. And again, and I'll use this example of one that from the depot, the Hort team, is to sit there and say that our sporting facilities, our ovals, are getting more use. So, we hire a whole heap of equipment to actually try and keep them in the best condition that they can be. If we actually had one of the machines on hand, because we're using it because of the usage and all that sort of stuff, we can actually deliver operating savings. Yes, we've got a capital cost up front, but effectively the payback on that from the savings that we're actually going to have in the current budget will actually give that payback. And that's the, and I think that was the refreshing thing from my perspective, is that the staff are starting to think that way. They're asking for that and saying, if you give me this, I can do this, rather than saying, well, what's the point? I won't get it type stuff. So they are starting to think about and putting forward some of those innovative ways of how we can actually deliver things, but it still does require some investment from a capital perspective as well. Again, the initiatives budget and any FTEs which we incorporate as part of the will change the operating result. So it will actually take that off. The next information session we have is scheduled for the 4th of March, I think I've got the date right, where we will actually present you'll have the opportunity to go through all the funding submissions that have been put forward that we recommend. And then once we actually get that, we can actually build that into it. But at the same time, even though while that's happening, we are still continually looking at the recurrent budget. So potentially there are some other, some more savings in there, and if there is more savings in there, we will actually present them as well at the 4th to sit there and say, actually, this is our starting point. From that perspective, so just in relation to the next steps, so again, we're continuing, even though we're here presenting a recurrent budget at the tonight, that's not the end of it. It will still be continue. We will still be challenging David, Andrew and Wendy. We will still be challenging you and questioning something if it doesn't necessarily look right. And all that sort of stuff. So we're not saying it's not right, but we will still be talking to you and challenging you there. We have the 4th of March session where all the initiatives and capital projects will be presented. There is a special council meeting scheduled for the 18th of March, which, with the intent of that, is actually to present the budget as a complete picture to you. So we can actually then forward it through to the audit committee. I have sort of held that over to sit there and say, depending on what happens in the 4th, that can actually be converted to another information session, and then we'll just take the draft budget to the council meeting on that the following week. Audit Risk will review it and provide their feedback. We'll have an information session where the Audit and Risk Committee, in particular the independent members, can come back and present, I suppose, their viewpoint, and you can hear their feedback and position firsthand. And then by that time, hopefully, we should have at least a couple of weeks of the valuations, the property valuations, so I can actually provide you some modelling scenarios of how this budget translates to what it means to the person on the ground as to what their rate increase will be looking like on an individual property basis perspective. And then we're planned for the 22nd of April to have it out for community consultation. So that's the plan. It's going okay so far. Yes, Brian?
At what stage in all of this that you're doing and the great work you are and your team is that we look at the assets that we have in this town? We looked at it around about 8 or 9 years ago, and somebody put it in the top drawer or the bottom drawer. I think it fell out. And we have some very valuable assets in this town. And another council that I pay rates to and that sort of thing have just recently sold off some of those assets, and without a doubt, at the moment, it certainly helped their budget. And we have, and I'll refer to one of the places where you stay when you come overnight, like Ethan does, and that sort of stuff that's worth about $3.5 million. And there's businesses and properties that we own, and we have a property officer. When does that come into your discussions to help you and your team with giving us some really rosy remarks?
I think that I know you're talking about asset sales,
in the sense of vacant land or buildings and all that sort of stuff. Again, while that will have an impact on our cash flow, it won't have an immediate necessarily impact on our operating budget from any level of significance. I think that that's probably another piece of work that the council needs to do over the 12 months, because we know that there's probably some leases that, like, you know, some arrangements that we actually have over some of the uses of the properties and that are coming up for renewal. And it's probably at that point in time, those discussions need to happen to sit there and say, do we actually want to continue to own these assets, or is it something that we can sell off and assist in that payment down of, because essentially that money would be allocated towards the payment of debt and reducing our debt balance as well. So I think it's probably a worthy of discussion because there are a couple of properties that we know that are coming out to lease, and we sort of sit there and wonder, me being someone new to Gawler, wonder why are we as a council still retaining particular pieces of land, other than the fact that we've always owned it, because it's not necessarily land that's actually, or an assets that we're using to deliver a particular service to the community. So it is probably worthy of a discussion, and Chris looks like he's going to say something.
No, Chris is trying to think on his feet and work out what he's going to say. Yeah, so I think with the next 12 months, Brian, the one impact of these financials, but I think with the next 12 months we need to work out when we're going to have a serious look at that and determine that. And there's two things to do with the money. The first one is you'd use it to pay down debt. That's one strategy. Or the second is you use it to fund a significant piece of community infrastructure rather than borrow. So there's two ways to handle that. The trick with it is to make sure you do not touch it to run your operations. I've seen too many councils do that in the past, and before you know it, the money's gone, and then 5 years later you're wondering what the hell happened to the money we got from that parcel of land. You want to make sure it gets embedded into hard assets or to pay down your debt, so you've actually got something tangible to show for it if we're going to make the decision to sell a community asset.
Say nothing of community engagement.
And of course, selling any community assets is a very
it's a very long
fraud's
process.
a good word, but it's important to have a conversation with the community along the way.
And again, it's if there's community title and all that sort of stuff, sometimes it takes 12, 18 months just to get that off as well, revoked. So it's not like you selling your one of your houses, Brian, that you just put it on the market and it just sells. Yeah. So before we finish up, is there any questions?
Are you able just to go back to the slide, I was just wanted to take note of the rate revenue increase, and then there was the fees and charges. Sorry, that was a